Confederacy. Union is the North, Confederacy is the South. And on here, I think on your paper, I have on it for listing advantages they have. So, when it comes when the war starts, 1861, who has more railroads, the Union or the Confederacy? All right, the North. All right, quite a bit more. Not only do they have more railroads, but they are also connected together better. And this is something that happened in the North that did not happen as much in the South. Most of the railroad lines in the North had a standard gauge. What does it mean by a standard gauge?
All the railroad track is connected.
Right, it's basically how far the rails are apart. In the South, what would happen is you might have a railroad line that goes from Ocala to Macon, Georgia, and the rails are 4.5 feet apart. And then from Macon, Georgia to Atlanta, the railroad line there, they're 5 feet apart. So you would have to take everything off of the one car and onto another one and have to do that along the way. Not very efficient. Where in the North, you just basically hitch up the cars and do what you do now. So again, North not only had more, their railroad system was set up better. Most of the southern railroads were simply get to the nearest body of water so it could be shipped out on the river. Who had the higher population?
North.
Okay, the North. And for the immigrants moving in, where are they moving to? North. So they're still getting more people coming in, which the Irish were coming in large numbers during the Civil War. And the South, a large part of their population was slaves. Is that a benefit or not to the South?
It's not.
Some ways it is a benefit because they're able to do some of the labor and all, but at the same time, it truly isn't. Aid of other nations, Britain, France, European nations. Who are they wanting to win this war? No, they want the South to win. So this is for the Southerners. This is their trump card that they think they have. If Britain can just go on their side. Think back to the Revolutionary War. How did the United States truly defeat Britain? Yeah, when the French came on. So the Confederacy looked at it and said, we get Britain or France on our side, that's all we need to kind of push over to get it. Now, Britain and France wanted the South to win. They wanted two Americas. Why? Right. We are weaker as two than as one, and we were quickly coming up and to be as powerful as they were. We weren't there yet, but we are surging up, and they knew in the future we would. So that's why they figured, hey, well, we'll have, if they can be split about that. Yeah.
So the South had the nation.
Yeah, the South, that was a Southern advantage. Yeah, these aren't in the exact order. You have to put them in the right place. Now, that Britain really wanted the Confederate government, but they had one problem with joining the Confederacy. What's the one problem? Yeah, the issue of slavery. Britain had outlawed slavery only almost 50 years before that, and the people of Britain would not have supported that. So even though the government was trying to find some reason in order to jump into this war on the side of the Confederacy, that did not have the people upset. All right, government structure. Okay, North. There is an organized government. Although it is seen as a negative thing, bureaucracy, okay, the structure you have within a government, how things are done. The North already has that. The South sets up a confederacy. Did that work for America in the beginning? No. A weak government is not what you need in a war. Not only is the North better off, when Abraham Lincoln takes presidency, he assumes even more power, and they become even more powerful to win the war. All right, purpose. All right, in the beginning of the war, the South. It's kind of like in the Revolutionary War. The South's fighting for their independence. They are fighting for their states' rights. Now, later on in the war, though, the North would have a purpose. What would that purpose be? All right, the issue to end slavery. In the beginning of the war, it wasn't. It would be later on that the North would have a moral purpose. But it would be a year and a half in the war before we get that. Money. Now, I say liquid money. No, not truly liquid. Liquid means it's something that you can spend on. Because you might have net worth. Like, I might have a house worth $1 million, but if I get in trouble, can I hand up my house?
Oh no.
You have money in the bank.
Oh,
The North. The South is extremely rich. This is where some people think of the South. Oh, it's just a bunch of poor farmers. No, the South was rich. 60% of our exports of our country came out of the South. But what was the South invested in? Land and slaves. So they did not have it in the bank. Money sitting in the bank, which when you want to go buy equipment and buy guns from another country, you gotta have gold. The North has that. By the way, what side is California on? They're on the north. So that gold for California is still flowing out, is coming into the north. Who has more manufacturing? Okay, the North. The South, some people look at it and say, oh, the South didn't have any. They did have some, but it just wasn't near as much. Areas like Birmingham had a little bit of a steel industry. Home field advantage. Okay, the South. Most of the fighting would take place on the southern states. But it wasn't as big of an advantage as you would think. Because, like William Sherman, as a general, is a great example of this. He had served earlier in his military career, he had served in different forts down in the South. So he knew the southern area. They had studied it. It's not like they were going to a complete different country. Plus, are there people in the South that stay in the United States? Yeah. Here in Florida, we actually had a lot. We had one of the highest percentage of people that stayed in the Union. There. We did not have a whole lot of rich plantation owners in the state of Florida. We were not a southern state in that way. Military leadership. Okay, in the beginning of the war, the South has an advantage. This seems weird that you would think, even though you have more of a population, how would more Southerners be good military leaders? Southerners like to fight?
Because they're more rugged,
They're more rugged, and we'll actually come back to that also. That part of it's the culture. If you grew up on a plantation, you are one of those planters. They didn't have public schools. Mom and Dad hired a tutor. Tutor came in. Not only did you learn math, English, you learned the classic languages. Remember Robert E. Lee had in the Mexican War, he had Latin and Greek. But you also have, it's almost like an ROTC class. You learn how to fight. You learn different techniques. You learn how to use a sword. Was part of the Southern heritage. It'd almost be like today, I mean, when you look at things, all right, the South, we're a heck of a lot better at football than in the North. Okay, I mean, New York and Florida are real even when it comes to the population. Yet there aren't a whole lot of good football players coming out of the state of New York compared to Florida. Is it that we're really that much tougher than those New Yorkers?
Yes.
Or is it part of our culture? I mean, high schools up in New York, it's a football game on a Friday night is not near as big. And the thing is, those of you that think that it's big here, all right, we're in the worst area of the state of Florida when it comes to high school football. The least amount of talent is in north of Tampa and DeLand. All right, we are the least talented that you have in the entire state of Florida. All right, you go down almost anywhere else in Florida. You compare that to in Georgia and Alabama and places like that, not to mention Texas. Okay, when you have stadiums, I mean, just go to Tampa Plant. They just spent 2 years ago over $1 million for their football stadium. Okay, I mean, it's part of our culture. Well, how was their culture at that time? A little bit more with the military side. If you caught what I said, though, in the beginning of the war, later in the war, though, some of the Southern military leadership, part of the problem was also some of that culture that you have in the South would actually hurt them. Because part of our culture was with those planter families. Do you ever shame some of those? Or they were always able to get some of those families were able to do whatever they want. Well, what happened if this person who was from a rich family from Alabama and he's not a very good general? Could Jefferson Davis fire him? No, because you can't get rid of Beauregard. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln had a little bit more freedom. When a general screwed up, what did he do? Fired him and replaced him with someone else. And eventually, he found someone good. Might have taken him a while. But meanwhile, in the South, Jefferson Davis had to say, okay, you're screwing up here, so I'm going to move you over here. Okay, now I'm going to move you here. Okay, let's just try to go and make it where you don't screw up someplace too bad. And that's where later in the war it actually would make a difference. There, the South would actually, and part of the other thing that was bad with the heritage, a lot of Southern generals wanted to show that they were nice and tough, and they would lead their soldiers into battle, and what would happen?
They'd get killed.
Yeah, they would get killed. And this is where, I mean, and actually this is what some of the Southern, when Robert E. Lee at times would go to lead his soldiers would say, no, we cannot have you killed. Okay, and there was times that they actually had people hold his horse Traveler and make sure he did not go into battle because they wanted to make sure that he wasn't killed. All right, Army. Now, the infrastructure of an army, the North. The U.S. Army is already there. The South, yes, we have a lot of people that had been trained in West Point. But for the South, they're having to still start out from scratch. They have a little bit bigger advantage than most places because it wasn't like they didn't have anything. Because some of those forts just converted over to the South. The northern soldiers left, and then basically they changed flags, and that was it. But for a Navy,
North.
huge advantage for the North.
They didn't have a navy.
Yeah, because
Right, the Confederacy had very little Navy. There were some ships they took over, like the forts, but for the most part they didn't. Now, those of you that do anything with naval history, the Confederacy did some incredible stuff for changes in naval history. The problem was when they would get something that they really do and were extremely ingenious on doing, they didn't have the manufacturing base to do it again and again. Meanwhile, the North could do it. So the North could take the Southern ideas and then use it against them.
Yeah, because didn't the South and first submarine.
Yeah, the first submarine that worked, the CSS Hundley. Okay, well, technically there was a submarine that Ben Franklin had kind of invented before, but one that sunk a ship. Yeah, Ben Franklin Revolutionary War, we could have made one there. But what?
Story.
Pretty much. But well, even for the Southern the Hundley, what they did is basically took. It was like today it'd almost be like a giant propane tank that they put on and stuff that that they put underwater and then attached them all to it. So, but the Navy was a huge advantage to the North, and here's where for some people, if you want to go military history, this is where if you want to go on the military slant, why the North would win, you could use as a thesis statement because of the Navy. All right, having to win.
South.
Does the South have to win in order to win?
Yes. Wait, what?
No, they just have to make the North quit.
Say it again?
They just have to make the North quit.
Yeah, they just have to make the North quit. Did we as the United States beat the British in the American Revolution?
No.
What did we do? Yeah, we outlasted them. So the Confederacy can just, if they can outlast them, a tie is a win.
So would that be for the North?
That is an advantage for the South.
South.
Okay? The North has to beat the South. The
Wait.
South just has to defend themselves, and a tie is a win for them.
So which one would we put on as these?
Maybe for the South because they don't have to.
The South does not have
It's
to
like
win.
a bird
Depends on how you want to work. So,
Got it.
who has the advantage of agriculture?
South.
The North.
What?
Even though the South's an agricultural area, what is the South growing?
Cotton.
Who has more horses? The North. Who has more pigs?
North.
Who has more wheat, barley, oats, corn?
Why would the North have more of all that?
Because all the South did was cotton.
The South is concentrated on cotton.
Well, the West
And actually, I have a thing to show you. There's one other thing the South did have an advantage besides more cotton. Well, tobacco too, which actually plays into something being important for some things. The South did have more mules. But if you go by agricultural things that you need for a war, and the North, one thing after another, being able to feed their soldiers. So it is kind of ironic that you would think agriculture, that the North would have it. But you have to remember, the North is not New Jersey, New York. Yes, it includes that, but the North also includes Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, which Ohio at that time was a big farming community. So that's where that is. All right, I have this question. If you were the South, do you need or want a long or short war?
Short.
Yeah, you want a short war.
Why would you want to
You don't have
So you can outlast the South
Because
has a long one.
the North has all the advantages for a prolonged war. More people, more factories, more money, more of all those things. The South, you need to do, basically, if you think of it as a boxer, you want to do a knockout punch as early on as possible. Because the longer it drags on, okay, you're a smaller, you might be smaller, faster, more agile there, but you're not gonna, if you don't get a good knockout punch in there, you're gonna get tired out and the big guy's gonna beat you.
But if the South had to outlast them, how could they have?
But how's the only way for you to think the military? What's the only way that the South can't outlast the
Kill all
North?
the people.
Go back to these other advantages. What other advantage does the South got to get in order to outlast
Foreign
them?
aid.
Yeah, the foreign aid.
Oh, alright.
That's the only way they can outlast. They can't outlast them on their own. Okay, but if they have France or Britain bringing them stuff in, and actually here's where we kind of put another war in there, and I did some comparisons before we said the American Revolution with Vietnam. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese were able to outlast the Americans, but they're getting aid from China. Okay, Soviet Union giving us some aid. So that's how they are able to go, and even though they shouldn't have. All right, here are some of the statistics that you look at, and those of you, this is where bar graphs come around. You see total population 71% to 29%. Bank deposits 81% to 19%. Factories 86% to 14%. But here's cotton. Okay, here's where there's a huge advantage for the gray is south. Food crops. Horses. Now, donkeys and mules, which is important because you need something to haul wagons around. So that is, don't go and make jokes about that. But as I said, if we were to have pigs and chickens, all right, it would be very similar to food crops and horses where the North would have an advantage. Railroad tracks. Okay, you're looking almost 3 to 1. Again, with it, you're looking at a bar graph this way. Factories, population, railroad tracks. Okay, so the factors you need to win a long-term war, all right, it is definitely for the North.
How effective is Continental War?
Well, and the only thing, this is where the South had thought, King Cotton. Why did the South survive the Panic of 1857?
Because the foreign countries are buying their guns.
Yeah, the foreign countries had stocked up. Plus, Britain was expecting. Britain had already started on some of their colonies, such as India and Egypt, starting to grow more cotton, expecting there might be a war. So they were prepared for it. Was not the trump card that the South thought that, oh, the world has to have our cotton. All right, the Union plan. Now, I have on here, with the Union advantage, should Lincoln plan for a long or short war? Yeah, he should plan for a long war. His main advisor is General Winfield Scott. Remember from the Mexican War, old fuss and feathers. Brilliant, brilliant mind when it comes to the military. There. He comes up with the Anaconda plan. Here's your SFI to make sure you know. Anaconda plan. What is an anaconda?
It's a snake.
How does that snake kill its prey?
Restricts it. Constricts
What?
It squeezes it.
Yeah, it constricts and squeezes it. So, this is where, and you see the political cartoon, Scott's Great Snake. Right here. Now, the 3 parts, and you do need to know these 3 parts. Part 1 is a blockade. Now, what is a blockade?
An obstacle.
Don't let anyone leave.
Don't let anyone eat. And what are you going to have to use in order to have a blockade?
So it's like a
The Navy. Does the North have a better Navy?
Yes.
Yeah. Can the South stop their Navy?
No.
No. And this is where the first thing you do, and you see where that snake is, you loop around on the shore. And at first, the North didn't have quite as many ships as they need, but you stop in certain areas, stop them at different ports. Mouth of the Mississippi River. Step 2, take over the Mississippi River. An anaconda constricts. Well, if you cut the Mississippi River, you take out the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. And you're squeezing them down. And the third part, because there are a lot of people saying that Lincoln needs to go for a short war, and this is part of it was, you want to take over their capital, which had been moved to Richmond. Now here's where, if they did a rattlesnake plan, that's the only thing you would do. Go straight to step 3. But I said it's an anaconda. Winfield Scott told Abraham Lincoln, there is a person that that would be the perfect person to do this. Because Winfield Scott knew he was old, he could not go out there and physically lead this plan. And Lincoln said, well, who do you think should be the person that leads us? Who? Yeah. And he had proposed a Colonel Robert E. Lee. A colonel. Now, those of you that know hierarchy in military, colonel is below generals. General. And then you would have a 4 or 5-star general. In wars, we'll have 5-star. So, you're going to have this general who is going to leapfrog the brigadier generals and all of these other generals and suddenly be on top of them. So realistically, he's going to jump, and I don't know the exact number, but 30, 50 people in order to be in charge of them. That's who Winfield Scott said, and Lee said, offer it to him. Do you think that Abraham Lincoln respected Winfield Scott's plan? All right, you say this person's the best person, put him in charge. Also tells you how much that Winfield Scott respected of Lee. Lee turned down the position. Why?
Family. He didn't feel right.
Now, who are his people? What's his country? His country is Virginia. Okay. Lee said, I cannot have my sword against my country. His country was not the United States. His country was Virginia. And it's kind of symbolic of the entire argument with states versus the federal government. Anyone know where Winfield Scott was from?
Virginia.
He's from Virginia too. Yet Winfield Scott stays with the United States. So not everybody is going right with their states. And this is even with Virginia. You've got Winfield Scott staying with the United States. He respected and understood Lee's decision, thought it was wrong. But what? Now, showing you the difference, and this is where we kind of look back in history. When Virginia did succeed from the Union, Lee went and offered his services. And the president there, Jefferson Davis, did not make him in charge of the Confederate troops. Where Lincoln had done that. What did Jefferson Davis put Lee in charge of? Anyone have a guess? The coastal defenses of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina.
Woohoo.
Basically, you're going to manage the forts along the sea and there. You don't have a navy to protect you, which essentially for Florida, the few ships the South had, you're not going to put them in Florida because it's not worth protecting. The plan that Lee had for Florida is, on the forts, you go and you hold your ground until those ships get in sight, and then you evacuate 20 miles inland and wait for them to get off the ships, and you fight them on the land. Okay, that was our plan for here in Florida. South Carolina, they tried to defend Charleston, they tried to defend Savannah and Georgia as much as they could. Not that it's not important, but is that nearly as important as in charge of all the forces of the entire nation? So, this is where somebody will look back at history. What if Davis would have said for Lee in the very beginning, here, you're in charge? He would not, until the last 6 months of the war, actually give Lee that honor. When there wasn't much of an army left to be in charge of. Yeah.
Which Lee was this again?
Robert E. Lee. All right, Robert E. Lee. And yes, he is from Virginia. All right, we'll stop there. We don't want to actually fire a shot yet. War. Remember, the South broke away. First of all, the 7 states. Then we would have 4 more that would break away. We would have the first shot of the war. Do we know who fired the first shot of the Civil War?
No.
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Not only do we know what side fired it, we know the exact person that lit the cannon that fired the first shot. I can't remember his name offhand. I'm forgetting it offhand, but I do know that at the end of the war he committed suicide because he could not believe that the South would lose there. But we know the exact person. Does it matter who fired the first shot?
Yeah. Yes.
Actually, it does in this case. Because for a lot of Northerners, their thing was, these states want to leave, let them go. Who cares? All right, good riddance. All right, y'all just go and complain about everything that's happening. But what happens when the Southerners then fire the first shot or take a swing at you? Is it still the same thing then? And that's why it really psychologically made a difference. one of the wisest moves that Abraham Lincoln made early on. He made sure at Fort Sumter, which is in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, that every day, the hotbed of the South, and here, there was one fort that he said, do not evacuate this fort, all right, there, but do not fire the first shot. Because he wanted to make sure that the South fired the first shot, if there was to be a shot fired there, because that way, it wasn't that the South's just defending themselves from a northern aggressor, which, if you go back in Southern history, all right, if you were in school here in Inverness back 60 years ago, it would not be called the Civil War. It would be called the War of Northern Aggression.
Really?
Yes. Okay, and the books that you would have. Okay, so you have a little biased slant to it. But this is where it was actually a wise move that Abraham Lincoln made to let the South get that first shot. Now, as a battle, it's not really much of a battle. Nobody died in the battle, although when they were doing the ceremony afterwards of basically transferring the fort, because after a little bit of time the North surrendered, gave it up, something happened and there was an accident and it was the powder keg and a person died that way. But the actual battle, nobody died. But that is where the first shot was fired. So remember Fort Sumter with that. It wasn't where the first shot should have been fired. We in Florida, we lost our chance at history, because the first shot should have been fired at Pensacola, Florida, at Fort Pickens. But we're going to find this one general that constantly, for the South, was late on what he was doing. And he wanted to wait for more soldiers to come in, and he waited to do that. And so a couple of days after Fort Sumter, then General Beauregard would fire upon Fort Pickens in Pensacola. But really, the difference was Fort Pickens stayed with the North the entire war because he was not able to take it during that time. All right, the first real battle. And here's where we get to what is for. After Fort Sumter, we have a couple of months. We have all these volunteer soldiers coming into Washington, D.C., all of them coming to Richmond. Total chaos in it, not really sure what's happening. Uniforms, there is no set uniforms that they have. If you were an officer for the Union Army and you now, like Robert E. Lee, commit yourself to the Southern, basically you wore the same uniform. The only difference was you took off your patch that said U.S. Army and you might have a CSA or something like that. But it's pretty much they're all wearing you. Each state had their own uniforms. Each town, if we had our local volunteers go, we might have it. This is why you see some of the uniforms that are pretty strange looking during the Civil War. Because like the ones from Rhode Island wore these things that look like they should be from the Middle East. There was no blue and gray at this time of the war. And actually during the entire war there truly wasn't blue and gray. Although the North would be more blue, the South would actually be more brown because they're wearing more homespun colors. But the first real battle, Bull Run, is about midway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. And everyone knew the battle was coming because as the North was moving south, the Southerns were moving northern. It looked like they were going to meet up at that town. We had not had a single battle fought on American soil since the War of 1812. So anybody that fought in a battle would have been at least probably close to 60 years old. And there wasn't a whole lot of fighting that took place in the War of 1812. And do we ever glorify war?
Yeah.
Yeah, really do. I mean, you just go sit around the VFW and it sounds like a pretty fun thing to do. But this is where when they heard about Grandpa and he was fighting, he was with Andrew Jackson, they whooped them British. Okay, well it sounded pretty cool. So you wanted to be part of the army and you wanted to do that. And so we had all these people come in and at Bull Run from the beginning, and this is where Northerners had said, this is going to be, all we're going to do, those Southerners, it's going to take us a second, we're going to just smack them on the butt, they're going to go surrender and it's over with. Southerners meanwhile said, all right, those Yankees, they don't know their left from their right when it comes to a gun. We're going to come, we're going to march right through them, and then we'll be up in Washington, D.C., and we'll be free forever. And the war will be over by lunchtime. People from Richmond and Washington, D.C. got their children, loaded them up in their buggies, and went up to find a good hillside to go watch the battle.
What?
Okay, I mean, this is where people thought. And then what ended up happening was, early in this battle, in this battle, the North kept on, and just the South was in total disarray and chaos. And they kept retreating, the North kept going, and it's kind of what people thought. Oh, look at this, they can't do anything. And then we get to this row of Virginians that stood, while everybody else is retreating, this row of Virginians, who were being led by their former teacher at what today is Virginia Military Institute. They stood. By the way, they hated their teacher, but then they ended up serving under him in the army and really loved this guy. But as they were all going, this is where one of the most famous quotes from General B said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," which is where the nickname of Stonewall Jackson comes. The Southerners then rallied around Stonewall Jackson, or Thomas Jackson and their troops. They counterattacked, and for the rest of the day pushed the Northerners off the battlefield. And then the North was in total disarray, heading back to Washington, D.C. So our first real battle was a Southern victory. But the one thing that it showed was this war was going to be a lot different than any other war, because there were a lot of people that were dead or wounded, a lot more than what we had seen in the War of 1812. The weapons were a lot better. They could be reloaded a lot faster. And we hadn't even gotten to the carnage, but this kind of showed with things. And for many cases, it showed that it was going to be a long war, a bloody war and a long war. How on there is called First Manassas by the South. The North would usually name things by what the nearest body of water is. The South by Manassas. Those of you that want to have some extra SFIs that are totally trivial, then you can kind of remember both names. Manassas is the nearby town. Is the town of Manassas. Okay. Bull Run was a creek. All right, Bull Run Creek. The North usually named it after a body of water, unless like at Gettysburg there was no body of water nearby. So, but that's why there are two different names in there. Most of the time we go by the northern name. Why?
Because they won.
Yeah, they won. When you win, you usually get to write the history. All right. Again, for you military history people, this always kills me to go through this so fast for things. But we will end up, and I'm going to divide this up. And in those 1862, there were a lot of battles that took place in 1862. 1861, there were a few things that were happening, but most things did not really happen at that time, because after the first Bull Run, basically they went and they said, we got to reorganize. In the East, very publicized, because Washington, D.C. is nearby, with two capitals are there. Robert E. Lee would have, because at Bull Run, the League General, General Johnston, had been wounded, and Robert E. Lee was then placed in charge of what is called the Army of Northern Virginia. So Lee is in charge of the army to defend Richmond. What would ultimately happen is time and time again, different northern armies would come down into Virginia to go try to take Richmond. Armies that were much larger than Robert E. Lee's army. And time again, Robert E. Lee and the Virginian army and other southern troops that were with them would defeat a much larger army. You don't really need to know any of these battles. We would have 7 days. We would have the second Bull Run, same place as Manassas. And this is where Robert E. Lee became known, and in history, one of the greatest military leaders, because he would win battle after battle when most things showed that he shouldn't have won. His right-hand man at that time was Stonewall Jackson, which you might remember from the People reports that we did. I mean, this is where Robert E. Lee, the reason why he and Jackson worked so well together is when Lee said, we're going to do this, which most people say that's impossible, Jackson would be like, okay, and they would have the same vision. And when Lee said, you attack at this time, he attacked at that time. One of the battles that we would have, the Lee would be fighting an army more than double his size, and still ended up defeating him that 7 days battle. Meanwhile, out west, most people were ignoring this. We have a general, Ulysses Grant, and what he did was he was winning with what the Anaconda Plan was actually all about. Now, I know the Anaconda Plan, step 2 is the Mississippi River, but there are some major tributaries off of the Mississippi River that also were part of that idea of it. The Cumberland River, the Tennessee River, the Ohio River, which they had controlled the Ohio River early on. But early on in the war, he would take over Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. One of them would stop any traffic coming up to the Tennessee River, one of them in the Cumberland River. So all the traffic that would have flowed into the Mississippi River from Tennessee is now stopped by him taking over these forts that overlooked it, and any traffic that went by had to go on there. We would then have the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh, or for you Southerners, Pittsburgh Landing. But at the Battle of Shiloh, and don't get too much with the trivia, but we would have the bloodiest 2 days of fighting. And here's where one of the biggest mistakes in the war happened, because early on the Southern general had attacked Grant's troops, and they completely surprised them, backed them up to the river, and they could have finished off and actually totally wiped out Grant's troops. But that general, the same one that was at Fort Pickens, decided, I'm going to wait until tomorrow morning. He doesn't have his artillery, he doesn't have his cannons because we overran him. He can't go anywhere because of the river. But he was woken up the next morning as the cannons were firing into the Confederates and the North attacked. How did overnight the North get all these cannons?
They still them.
Not still, they have the river. Who has the better Navy? The North. They control the rivers because they have the Navy. What should have been an incredible victory for the South and would have wiped out the Western Army for the U.S. ended up being a victory for the North because this Confederate general waited there. Meanwhile, a lot of people kept telling Abraham Lincoln he needed to fire Grant. Why fire Grant? What's he doing wrong?
Nothing.
Well, he still something wrong. He supposedly was drinking too much. All right, he dressed like a slob. Which Lincoln's response for this was, well, if he's drinking, I need to get whatever it is that he's drinking and give it to my other generals. Because he was winning while these other generals, and when going to part for Lee, it was general after general after general. That Lincoln would put them in charge and they'd lose the lead. He'd put another person in charge and they would lose. They would lose the lead. Went through a cycle again with them. We later on would have New Orleans captured. What's so important about New Orleans?
The bottom of the Mississippi.
Yeah, the mouth of the Mississippi River. When New Orleans was taken over by David Farragut, some of you know we have Farragut Academy nearby in St. Petersburg, named after him out there, but that is where when he took over him, or took over that is a step in the Anaconda plan. So they are going with Winfield Scott's Anaconda plan. Again, there's a lot of battles here I'm not telling you about, but this is where you don't have to be a military historian. We then get to a battle you do need to know about. Antietam. And I have on here, after multiple victories in Virginia, Lee took his army to the border state of Maryland. Why? In 1862, after winning battle after battle, defending Maryland, or defending Virginia, would he go up into Maryland?
He tried to keep winning.
Well, he wanted to keep winning. There's a couple of different reasons they have. One is it was in the fall. He wanted to take the battles into Maryland so the farmers have a chance to harvest their crops. Plus, he figured he could go into Maryland, get supplies while they're and he was hoping if his army went to Maryland that border state would actually switch and join the Confederacy. Going back to that, why the Confederate flag has 13 stars, well, they were hoping that 2 more of those states would actually join with them. Maryland was one that they thought would. Missouri was another one, or Kentucky that they thought would, but they did. So he went up in there. And again, he had won battle after battle. I have the question, what about 3 cigars? The reason why Antietam, one of the reasons why it will be real important is Lee is finally defeated. But how he is defeated is a general that was the one that lost to him in 7 days earlier in the time. He's now back in charge. One of the officers found 3 cigars on the side of the road. And what had happened was, wrapped around those 3 cigars were Lee's battle plans. Basically said, we're going to go here. He split up his army. So even though he has a smaller army, he split up his army and sent Stonewall Jackson to Harper's Ferry. Now you remember Harper's Ferry from John Brown. What's in Harper's Ferry that Stonewall Jackson's going to get?
Guns.
Yeah, guns. It's an arsenal. So he sends him miles and miles away, splits up a smaller army. Not a smart thing to do, but Lee figures, well, we'll get this, and then we'll trick him in that way. McClellan has Lee's plans. He knows Lee has his army split up, knows where he's going, knows where everything is. And McClellan waits. And he said, no, this is a trick. All right, Lee's trying to trick me again. And the whole time then, the reports are coming in from the telegraph that Harper's Ferry's been attacked. Stonewall Jackson's troops are here. And he's getting, everything's happening according to the plan. Lee doesn't know the plans were stolen. So finally McClellan, there's this picture of the man right here. Finally McClellan does attack him at Antietam Creek, which is outside the town of Sharpsburg. And for again the trivia, the bloodiest day of the war would occur when basically they set up that trap. And I know you can't see all these pictures, but this is part of what would be Bloody Angle. And these are pictures taken the next day by, or at the end of the day by Matthew Brady of the body that were there. And there was, if I remember right, in this one part, there were about 14,000 soldiers that were killed in that afternoon. What happened with Bloody Angle was it was a sunken road, and it kind of comes as a V, and as the troops were marching in there, the other troops were basically a natural trench they were able to shoot into and have them in a crossfire. Here's where another mistake was made. McClellan had Lee backed up to the river, only one way out with one bridge. Now, I know none of you in here are generals, but if you have an army trapped and there's only one bridge, what would you probably do?
With the bridge.
Yeah, blow up that bridge. Did McClellan do that? No. And he also waited. And Jackson was able to move his troops over 50 miles in one day. You all would not have want to been in Jackson's army. They were called the foot cavalry because they would travel as much ground by foot as a cavalry on horses would travel. Okay. Yes, he was a great general, but if you're a soldier, you better be ready to move.
Is he like
What? No, he was.
Was he on the
There's, yeah, he was on the horse, riding around with his one arm up above his head because he thought that one arm weighed more than the other for his balance. With a lemon in his mouth, which he actually was smart with that because he thought that would keep away diseases, which it probably did. Jackson was a strange man. Great general, strange man. But Jackson gets there, helps to protect, and Lee slides back into Virginia. McClellan should have wiped him out, which ultimately. And there he wins at this battle, but Lincoln fires McClellan. Why did he fire him? Yeah, he won, but he should have won even bigger. All right, should have in some ways ended not in the war, but at least come close to ending the biggest threat there was there. Now I had the question: where would McClellan show up again? Anyone know where he's going to come back up in history before this war is over? And not. 1864, he would run for president against Lincoln. You think there's a little rivalry between McClellan and Lincoln? So this is where McClellan would remember that. Now, yeah. Well, he was demoted. He was demoted by, I believe, he ultimately. I mean, he was given such menial assignments. Basically, McClellan was a guy that on paper should have been an excellent general. His problem was he was really overly cautious. And this is where the different generals knew each other. Lee had worked with McClellan earlier in the military career. Lee knew McClellan was overly cautious. One of the little things that he did, and actually copied this from something that George Washington had done at Yorktown, but he had at 7 days actually had a group of soldiers marching around in a circle in this one town. So his scouts were watching, and they kept saying, "Oh, well, all these troops keep on going there." And so Lee made McClellan think he had an army of over 100,000 when he actually only had about 60,000 troops. Okay, so McClellan was afraid to attack there. Lincoln actually had to issue an order for him to attack. All right, because Lincoln's getting things, because Lincoln was one big time with spies, and he's getting all these reports. Lincoln says, "No, Lee's army is such and such size. It's right here. We know where it is." And McClellan's like, no, it's bigger than that. I don't know where your reports are coming from. And that's where, again, these people knowing each other, they fought with each other. And there's a lot of little stories like that in the Civil War. Yeah.
So why was this victory so important for the North?
Okay, and this is where we come to that. What would Lincoln write after Lee was finally defeated? Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation, which is what Lincoln would write. Finally, Lee had been defeated. Now, what does the Emancipation Proclamation say?
All the slaves in the South states are free.
Okay, the slaves in the states of rebellion, which would be in the South, are free. What do most people think it did?
Free slaves.
They think it freed the slaves. What did it really do? All right, because how many slaves did it legally free? Yeah, 0. So what's the why is it important?
It's going to show that the North is trying to take power over the South or something.
All right, made the issue of slavery. Where in the beginning of the war, why was it that the North was fighting in the beginning?
States' rights.
No, that's the South.
For
To keep the Union.
Yeah, or in Lincoln's own words, to preserve the Union. Basically, you're not allowed to leave. Now, when finally, see, in the West, Lincoln knows in the West that the South is losing. It's not in the newspaper because everyone's just paying attention to what's happening. It's kind of like in baseball. There, everyone pays attention to what the Yankees and the Red Sox are doing. Meanwhile, the Giants are out there winning World Series. Okay, but this is where we have an East Coast bias. What would actually free the slaves later on? With what though? What would legally free slaves? 13th Amendment, and that's one of the amendments you have to. After the war was over, the 13th Amendment would free slaves, not the Emancipation Proclamation. But the Emancipation Proclamation is extremely important as it makes the issue of slavery there. All right, here we go. I say the turning point. Antietam is one of the battles you must know. There are 2 other battles you must know during the war, besides the first battle in here. But this is where we get to it. The 2 most important battles they're seen, and I put these 2 together. You might have some things that will write it and make it even overly simplified as one. But these happened within a week of each other. First of all, Vicksburg would finally fall. After months and months of a siege, the town of Vicksburg would fall. Vicksburg is on the Mississippi River, and Grant would capture it. It's up on a very large bluff. What happens, the Mississippi River goes through a very sharp turn. If you are a steamboat, you have to slow down real slow to go around this curve. And as you slow down, you are right there where those cannons are going to be able to shoot you and take your ship out. That was the last place that the South had on the Mississippi River. It falls. So why is that important? Well, what's step 2 of the Anaconda plan? Control the Mississippi River. Well, they had New Orleans. Now they've got it. They got the last one. They now completely control the Mississippi River. Okay, here's our checklist. Blockade, check. Mississippi River, check. What's left?
Take over the capital.
Take over the capital. All right. Now this is 1863 in July. There. Again, remember the Anaconda. Around the time that the Vicksburg is falling, we have Robert E. Lee for a second time making an invasion into the North. And in the North, he would end up, well, first of all, earlier in 1863 is when Stonewall Jackson would die, accidentally shot and killed by his own soldiers. And it was an accident there. And that would make a big difference because after that, Lee would make another invasion into the North. First one didn't work out too good, but this time make sure that your battle plans don't get into the other general's hands. Reason why Lee was doing this. He's getting reports. He knows Vicksburg is going to fall within a couple of days. So he wants to make it look like he is making an invasion like he's going to New York City. Had no plan ever to go to New York City. But he figures if he gets the North in a panic, as he's invading up north, that they would do a surrender and he could end the war right there. One last battle. Let's end it before Vicksburg falls. Because realistically, we have 2 major armies. One out west, all right, and one in the east. And the one out west looks like they're going to lose. But he gets to Gettysburg. First of all, his cavalry and his general, Jeb Stuart, is riding way off, and he's blind. Okay, without your cavalry in the armies at the time was your eyes. Jeb Stuart's quite a character. We're saying that it's kind of like they were the movie stars of the day were the generals. The press followed around Jeb Stuart, and he got too far away from things. He doesn't have Stonewall Jackson to do things here. His troops come together, and first of all, he wouldn't know what supposedly the story is, the reason why Lee was even going to Gettysburg. What was in this little Pennsylvania town that he needed? There supposedly was a shoe factory.
Oh.
And and he needed shoes for his soldiers. Does the South have shoe factories? Not really. So that's why. Now there's some things that maybe that wasn't totally true. It just happened to be there. They were going, but that's what. But ultimately, what would happen at Gettysburg after 3 days of fighting? Lee is defeated. No, he's not. His army is defeated. Lee retreats. He does not surrender his army. He is able to retreat, but he loses. Second time that he loses. Now he has a whole lot of wins, but he loses. And in actual numbers, the North loses more soldiers than the South. If I remember right, the North lost like 28,000, and the South lost about 25,000 people in this battle.
They have more people to spare.
They have, and that's what they have, a lot more to spare. A little bit later on, Lincoln would give the Gettysburg address, and where I have like the bloodiest days. This would be the bloodiest 3 days of the war that we would have. Again, over 50,000 Americans when you combine the two armies together that are casualties at this battle. But what ultimately happens is we would have Vicksburg and Gettysburg within a week of each other. The war would go on for 2 more years, but it is basically a downward spiral for the South. The final 2 years, Lincoln finally finds someone that keeps winning, so he puts Grant and brings him and puts him in charge of the East. He needs somebody to be able to fight against Lee. Grant then puts his subordinate, which is William Tecumseh Sherman, and puts him in charge of the Western Army. Sherman leaves Vicksburg and heads towards Atlanta. Captured Chattanooga, then captures Atlanta, and at Atlanta basically totally wipes out what is left of the 2nd Southern Army. Sets the city of Atlanta on fire. Actually, he doesn't. The Southerners actually, some of the biggest explosions you have was the South were actually blowing up their own supplies so that he wouldn't get it. But Sherman became famous for the March to the Sea. And this is where the idea of total war comes from. Grant was the first one to use it, but then Sherman would do it. The idea was you take the war to the people. And the March to the Sea, from Atlanta to Savannah, he spread his army out. Remember, there was no Southern army to fight against them. Spread it out, 60-wide mile path, and destroyed everything. As you went inside, you set the fields on fire. You came across, you had horses and cows, you killed them. He didn't worry about his supply lines. He told the people, his soldiers, live off the land. And they ate good every single night because they killed any chickens, hogs, pigs, or cows, everything that they had there. They just ate and they traveled in it and destroyed it. And when the people came to Sherman and the army and said, "Why are you destroying our land?" He said, "Tell Lee to surrender." All right. Georgia was the breadbasket of the South. So that is where it said, tell them to surrender. Once they got to Savannah, they then turned and went up into what would be South Carolina, went all the way up into North Carolina, and we're on the edge of North Carolina when Lee finally would surrender in the east. But that is where you remember the March to the Sea. One little side thing is for Atlanta, you notice that the date is August 1864. During this time, this is while the presidential election's going on, and when Sherman would win Atlanta, this is where a lot of historians will look at things and say that kind of secured the presidency for Lincoln to win re-election.
What was the March? I don't understand what the March to the Sea was.
That's part of the total war. The idea was to destroy everything in the South.
Oh, okay.
You're going to take it to the people. It's not just army fighting army. It was a whole new idea that you're going to take it to civilians, which is what we would end up doing in warfare for basically the next 100 years. Today now we do more strategic bombing. Okay, we've kind of gone away with it. In the East, for 2 years we would have Lee fighting Grant. Now, battle after battle was a tie. Grant might win a few little ones there, but Lee won most of them. But Grant didn't care. He kept attacking and kept attacking. His nickname that he got by his own soldiers was the Butcher. They didn't have dog tags at that time, but there were his soldiers actually almost started with the idea was dog tags. Because they would go and they would pin their name and their hometown onto the back because thinking that they were going to die. And Grant kept attacking, kept attacking, kept attacking. Why?
I think the South's going to run out of soldiers soon.
And this is where Grant knew Lee was a great general, but he also knew the advantages the North had. If Grant went to a battle and he lost 10,000 soldiers and Lee lost 5,000 soldiers, Grant could easily replace those 10,000. Could Lee replace his 5,000?
No.
And ultimately, by the time that Lee would surrender to Grant at Appomattox, and this is a place to know, this is the surrender, all right, the Appomattox, which would be retreat to end it, Lee had an army of 7,000 soldiers. Grant's army that surrounded him at that time was over 80,000. He had another 100,000 something soldiers that were in Washington, D.C. that could be there in 3 days, even quicker with trains. He had another army of about 60,000 in nearby in the Shenandoah Valley.
How many did we have?
7,000.
Lee was down to 7,000. And those 7,000 soldiers were begging Lee not to surrender.
Oh.
Okay, and to continue fighting on and go into the mountains and keep fighting. And that's where Lee would surrender. All right, we're not going to have the reflection questions here. I'll give it to you. So make sure that you start studying ahead or something. Study for your people more for today, since I didn't quite finish this section. So we got to get to Florida part, because we are really important in the Civil War. So, all right. Grant versus Lee. I kind of rushed through that at the end yesterday. After Vicksburg, Grant comes to the east. Lincoln puts him totally in charge of everything. Grant lets William Tecumseh Sherman continue on in the west. He goes from Vicksburg. He then travels. He actually wins and loses a few battles, but continues on, weakening what was left of the Western Confederate Army, which now the Western Confederate Army is pushed all the way back into Tennessee and then into Georgia. They're making one last stand at Atlanta, which is the breadbasket of Atlanta. It falls. The Confederates actually set most of Atlanta on fire. Sherman then spreads his army out in a 60-mile wide path, destroys everything, and this is what is sometimes called a Sherman necktie. Not only did they tear up the railroad ties in there, but they would actually heat it up and wrap it around the tree. Why would they do that? Yeah, you could use it. Sometimes you just heat it up and just twist it a little bit. It'd be kind of like a paper clip. If you undo a paper clip, yeah, you can put it back, but is it ever going to work the same? Could you put a train on something that you twisted a little bit after it's been heated up? So that's why they made sure they were physically destroying the South. That's what that phrase "total war" comes in.
When you said that the Confederate Army was back in Tennessee, I thought Tennessee was like neutral.
No. Kentucky had people fighting on both sides. Now, actually with Tennessee though, you're sort of right. Tennessee was part of the Confederacy, but in the mountain areas of Tennessee actually had one of the largest groups of people that were loyal still to the United States. And we'll find that in the mountain areas, which you kind of think of it. In the mountain areas, do you have very many rich slave-owning people? No. So this is where we go all the way back to the beginning of our colonies, the Bacon's Rebellion. When we have people on the edge of the frontier compared to the rich, and that rich versus poor. We'll have that when I get to Florida. We actually have that here in Florida also, where we have a lot more people that are still staying loyal to the Union there. Florida had one of the highest percentage of people that were actually loyal to the Union.
We also sent the most troops to the Civil War.
No, we sent the highest percentage of our population. Florida. We did not send the most troops. We actually had one of the lowest numbers of troops. All right, so we'll get to that in a second. All right, but to finish up with the actual war, so we have Sherman. He gets to Savannah, then marches north. In the east, here's where you get to some incredible parts with battle. Grant versus Lee. They are fighting in Northern Virginia. 1864, it is a constant battle. One battle after another after another. Grant doesn't care if he loses. His whole idea is he is going to make Lee's army so weak that he has no choice to surrender. See, what had happened for the first 3 years of the war is Lincoln hired a general. They would go into Virginia, attack, lose to Lee, go back to Washington, D.C., regroup, go back and attack, lose, regroup, and keep going back. Every time Lee had a chance to go, and one of the things we're going to see that is a change over time for the Civil War is Lee would bring up the tactic of trench warfare. All right, it had been used before, but this is where he would be one that would really make it a modern war in that aspect. What's kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. What happens in the Civil War is this is our first modern war. First, because of Industrial Revolution, but second, because of the tactics using with the weapons. And what happens in the Civil War will then lead to what happens in World War I. And even though you're talking about 50 years later, and the weapons get even better by that time, World War I, what they did is they studied how did Robert E. Lee win, or win battles. Again, lost the war. But ultimately, Grant would take over him. And again, he was trying to win. The thing was to win the war for Grant, not win battles.
How is it classified as a modern war if every war that we fight is modern for the time?
Well, modern tactics, and this is where, and actually more so with the modern weapons. And I'm going to go through different weapons and all here in a second. So. All right, Appomattox. Remember Appomattox? That is where Lee surrendered to Grant. It is significant. What's kind of funny is the house that he actually surrendered in. The guy moved to the place called Appomattox Courthouse because he wanted to get away from the fighting. Because his original home was in Manassas, and his original home was right where the first Bull Run was. So the first battle, the real battle of the Civil War, occurred literally in his yard, and the war ended there. It technically did not end at Appomattox. There was still a few other smaller groups that were out fighting, but that was the largest army left for the Confederates, even though it wasn't that large. And over the next couple of weeks, all the other smaller groups would slowly surrender there. But for the most part, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, it is basically the end of the war at that time. Or is it? So we'll see. All right, other war things to have. First of all, we have ironclads.
Do you know any battles were in the Civil War?
It depends on what you want to define as a battle. Because is a battle, if we have a couple hundred people fighting a couple hundred people, is that a battle or is that a skirmish? So, and this is where, like, even in Florida, we have different things to say for different battles, and like for the Florida side, but we have truly only one real battle. And even there, that one battle we had lasted one day, and the armies were each about 10,000 people. So you compare that to what Lee and Grant had, that's nothing. But that's our biggest battle here in Florida. All right, what is an ironclad? It's a boat, but what about it? Covered in iron. The Confederacy did not have a great navy, but they did a lot of things with their navy. The first ironclad ship in warfare was made by the Confederate States of America. Now, for you good Southerners out there, it is not the Merrimack. You would refer to it as the CSS, Virginia. But it originally was the Merrimack. What happened was the Merrimack was a U.S. Navy ship that was being built, and after Virginia had seceded from the Union, at that shipyard they set it on fire, but it was put out and the top part burned. Well, the Confederates came up with a plan to rebuild the top part, and they coated the bottom part with iron. Now, the Merrimack looked almost like a fort. This is the Merrimack, or Virginia. And you had cannons that were sticking out of it. It is a steamboat. And you had iron plating. Now, most of you, the only thing you know of iron is like a cast iron skillet. Pretty heavy. Well, you have these things, and you literally just basically, they screwed it onto the side of the ship, which this boat then sunk down there. Meanwhile, the Union, their spies had found out that Southerners were making this. They were making their own version, which was the Monitor. The Monitor has a turret on it. Now, most of you know of a turret. That's something that turns like the top of a tank. So it's two different versions. It's kind of like a floating fort, and then this is almost like a floating tank. They went at top speed of almost 3 miles per hour. Could not move very fast because they were so heavy. When the Merrimack first went out, it could not go out unless the water was extremely calm, and it took over a half hour for it to make an 180-degree turn, because it couldn't turn very fast with it because its gallows were so shallow. But it came out the very first time. There were 3 Union ships where it was at. Came up to the first one. The first one's shooting at it. The cannonballs are just all bouncing off. And it goes up to it, shoots holes in the side, and disables that ship. Goes after another ship, is able to ram it, because what they have, and this is, you can kind of see it here, they have a big metal ram, They just ram it to the side of the ship, then put the motors in reverse, pull it out.
Real quick, the worst sailor ever. How did they catch them?
Well, they were because again they're looking at things and not realizing that. Okay, they're thinking, oh well, we got this thing moving real slow. Let's just shoot cannonballs at it. Well, it doesn't stop, and by the time they decide let's get going, it's too late to do that. The third ship said, let's get away from this, and as it goes to get away from it, it goes into a sandbar, and it becomes disabled. So on the very first day that the Merrimack is out fighting, it takes out 3 U.S. Navy ships.
Dang.
And rumors go flying up in New York City and everything else that this ship is sailing up the coast, it's going to come into New York Harbor, it's going to destroy everything. Which it wasn't going out in the open ocean. All right, it went back in and basically went in for repairs. A few days later, we would have the Monitor, which is being tugged at that time, or towed in from the north. Then we would have the first battle of ironclad ships, the Monitor versus the Merrimack. Who wins? Why do you say the Monitor? The turret is better, the north wins?
I said the Merrimack.
Why do you say the Merrimack?
It ran into the side of the Monitor. It punctured the steel or the iron.
Guess what happened when the Merrimack fired upon the Monitor?
Nothing happened.
Yeah, the cannonballs bounced off. And what happened when the Monitor fired upon the Merrimack?
Bouncing back.
Best.
And guess what happened at the end, after they got done shooting all their cannonballs?
Is that
They
there?
chugged away from each other and nobody won. Okay, so nobody wins this battle, but it is the start of modern naval warfare because do we use wooden ships most of the time now in the Navy?
Yes.
Now, the South makes the very first ironclad ship, and do they have factories and shipyards to make more and more of them? They would actually end up sinking the Merrimack themselves to make sure the North didn't get a hold of it later on, and the North would end up making over 100 of the ironclad ships because they had the production capabilities. The South would make the very first submarine that would sink a ship with the Hunley, but it didn't really matter. I mean, they were very unique, and actually, this is the person that was in charge of the U.S. the Confederate Navy was actually from Florida, but he didn't have much to work with because between the blockade, not having factories, and the fact that the Union has more Navy to start off with, the Confederacy can't do much with it. And as I have the question, who would use it as an advantage? Well, it was the North that ended up using it as an advantage, even though the South invents it.
Before the South wanted help from foreign nations, why did that never happen?
Well, we'll find out that there's actually one ship called the Alabama that they would get a lot of help and cause a lot of damage, and it would be a modern ship in a different way. All right, other warfare changes. Less usage of the cavalry. What was the cavalry?
Horses.
Why do you think there's going to be less usage of the cavalry in the Civil War than every war before it? All right, but it's changing warfare. What changed?
Guns.
The guns. Guns can be reloaded faster and can shoot further. See, it used to be, and the way that you fought in the Revolutionary War, remember the straight lines, or they're marching in straight lines. Basically, you get in something a little bit bigger than a football field. You get in straight lines, and it's almost like a chess match, and you go and move around. Well, it took about a minute to reload those guns. Remember, our Minutemen can reload in a minute. Well, if you had the whole line fire, and then you had the cavalry come charging in. And realistically, the accuracy of the guns for most of the muskets in the Revolutionary War were about the length of a football field. Can a horse come charging across a football field in less than a minute? Yeah. So you would have the soldiers on the horses, and then you have your swords, and you come charging in on them after they fire. That's why you actually, in the Revolutionary War, you lined up in lines, and you had this line fire, and then like 15 seconds later, another line, and you always had at least one line that was loaded there, so that if they were to charge, you were trying to hold them off. By the time we get to the Civil War, a lot of the standard weapons could fire sometimes up to a mile, and could be reloaded in 15-20 seconds. Can a horse run a mile in 15 to 20 seconds? So it doesn't do a whole lot of good to come charging in. So the cavalry still was around, but it was used more for scouting. All right, what is trench warfare?
This is not when you sit in trenches and you just start shooting at each
Yeah,
other.
you dig ditches, and then basically you keep your soldiers in there, and they have to come towards the trenches. That's what Robert E. Lee did. He would sit there and he would protect certain areas, let the North come into them, and then he would do a counterattack from there. So he mixed the old style with the new trench warfare. But he learned to defend himself. And when you are in those trenches, you're not out in the open. Yeah, you're below ground. I mean, later on in World War II, we did that where we would dig foxholes. And that idea that you're digging and you're getting and you're shooting and you're protecting most of your body that you have.
Did the U.S. come up with the idea of trench warfare, or did they use
Now, it actually had been used some before that. It was just Robert E. Lee perfected there and really showed, especially with the modern weapons. Because before it didn't matter as much when, well, you could get pretty close to someone before you actually attack. Now, if you have that, and I have weapons longer range, not just talking about guns. We will have cannons. We will have what are called mortars, where you shoot something up and over. Sometimes they can fire miles away. The North actually had these giant mortars that they don't have it on railroads. And this is where modern railroads come in. They could fire, some of them, I mean, they could fire 5-6 miles away. So you wouldn't be anywhere close to the battlefield, but you could be actually making a difference by shooting off giant cannonballs there. And there wasn't in wars before that you would have that. And again, the quicker reload. Balloons. Isn't that nice to go when they get balloons like birthday parties? What balloons are being used? Yeah, hot air balloons. How are you using a hot air balloon in that war? Well, they know you're not really spying, but you're scouting them because it's kind of hard to hide when you're up there. But yes, you are watching them. And this is where, and the North had a lot more of this than the South. If you had a hot air balloon, they just didn't let them float across. What they would do is they would send somebody up, and that way they're up high enough. Could you, and again, warfare was almost like a chess match. The part you would try to do is to move your pieces where they didn't know it, and you can surprise them. You outflank them. Well, if you are up pretty high up in the air, and you got a telegraph, because you can't yell down to them, they don't have walkie-talkies, but you have a telegraph, and you can telegraph then that they are moving troops to the west.
How can you telegraph it? You have a wire?
You have a wire. A wire going up, because you have a giant rope tied up with a balloon. You have a telegraph. You telegraph down, they're moving troops to the west. So, message gets sent to that general, go protect your west flank. They're coming in from that side. And that's where we end up with the balloons being used for surveillance. Not really truly important, but this is something that kind of is a change in warfare. What is a Gatling gun?
It's like a machine gun.
Yeah, it was basically our very first machine gun. Now, why do I say that's not real important overall?
You didn't use it a lot?
Yeah, it wasn't used a whole lot, but it was invented, and by the end of the Civil War, it's being used a little bit.
Was it like a...
Yeah, it looks like you have a crank going with it, but it is our original, basically our original machine. It was invented later in the war, and they weren't able to perfect it well enough. And by the time they get it perfected, the war's over. So, I mean, but again, we go to our next major war. Sorry for Spanish American War people, but the next major war, would machine guns have any impact in World War I? Yeah, hold on. Any impact in warfare today? So again, this is where we kind of change that concept. All right, what's a grenade? Explosive that you throw. Used any in warfare today?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we had some rude grenades there, but we actually had made them a lot better in there. Landmines. One of the worst things that you can ever have in warfare. Those were made a lot better during the Civil War. And that's getting some of the modern war. Now, the other thing that happens, I say railroads and telegraphs. And this is where the North would have a huge advantage, because they communicated with each other. Robert E. Lee did not have this, and if you want to say one major flaw that Robert E. Lee had was he did not take advantage of telegraphs, where the North did, especially Abraham Lincoln. And this may have been one of the biggest things that Abraham Lincoln did, was figure out that communication. And Abraham Lincoln's commander-in-chief, and he does take that role serious. He is actually, at time, even though he is hundreds of miles away from the battlefield, giving orders to his generals of what to do in that battle. And for Abraham Lincoln would pretty much sleep in the War Department, and he went through and would read the telegraphs as they came in from different battlefields. No president had ever been able to do that before. Not in the Mexican War, not in the War of 1812. But that's where Abraham Lincoln was truly connected with it, and a true commander-in-chief. Where I said, did the war really end? Well, Ford's Theater.
Yay.
John Wilkes Booth, what does he do?
Kills them.
Yeah, he kills Lincoln. Now, John Wilkes Booth is upset about the South losing the war, which this is, we're talking about less than 2 weeks after the surrender at Appomattox. Abraham Lincoln's wife convinced him to go see this play called My American Cousin. It was a British play. John Wilkes Booth is one of the top actors at that time. He is one that he doesn't like the fact that the South lost, and he ends up going up during the play into the presidential box and will shoot Lincoln in the head, which Lincoln would die before the next day comes about. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth, he jumps down from there. His boot actually gets caught on the curtain as he's jumping down from the balcony. His leg breaks. And this is where Dr. Mudd comes. Have you ever heard of the saying that your name is Mudd?
Why do you have to jump? Why do you have to jump down?
I guess
Why
that's
can't you
where
just go
his
back the way you
escape
came?
plan. I don't know. But when he came there with it, which the September Tyrannus, the South is avenged, is what he said after he shot Lincoln. Dr. Mudd, though, was the person that then helped fix John Wilkes Booth where he had a broken leg, and so he is kind of seen as part of the conspiracy that we had. There was a lot more conspiracy to kill Vice President Johnson, kill other members of the cabinet. Most of the people that were involved with the other part of the conspiracy to kill him, most of them chickened out. And John Wilkes Booth did what he had. But I have this question, and this is actually the more important part. The trivia part is who killed Lincoln. This is the important part. Why is the death of Lincoln so bad for the South?
Because it said the South was avenged, and the
Makes
South
him-
was
makes him-
madness.
Makes him a martyr.
Well, somewhat makes more. In some ways, it actually helps Lincoln probably for history, because he dies at the right time. Where it's bad for it is Lincoln's plan for the South to come back into the Union is a very easy plan. Lincoln was very forgiving. His plan was called the 10% plan. The reason why it's called the 10% plan, and we'll get to the Reconstruction here in a couple of days, but if 10% of the Southerners in that state said, I swear allegiance to the United States, and give an oath to them, you're back in. So 1 out of 10 people say, I'm sorry. All right, and back in. Is that a pretty nice, easy plan? And Lincoln was strong enough, since he was the president, that he probably would have been able to force that plan through. And it would have been an easier way for the South. The next president is President Johnson. Well, he'll get impeached because he's going to have problems because Congress doesn't. Remember that guy Charles Sumter? The one that Preston Brooks had hit over the head?
Yeah.
He's going to be one of the main people in charge of the Reconstruction of the South. Do you think he is nice and forgiving like Lincoln will
I
be?
thought he had brain damage.
Well, he's now, we're talking about 5 years later, 6 years later.
They let him in when he had brain damage.
Well, it's not severe. He recovered from most of that. But that is where it would be. And this is where it would end Lincoln's 10% plan, all right, which is an easy plan that we would have. All right, now for some non-AP stuff, but where it is important because you do live in Florida. What is the most important place in Florida during the Civil War? Not Tallahassee. Bobby Bowden isn't there yet.
Key West?
What?
Key West?
It's Key West.
Really?
All right. Nobody said St. Augustine. Usually we have St. Augustine. But why is Key West, which is Massachusetts, why is that the most important?
That's where the blockade was.
Pretty close.
How far is it from Key West to Cuba?
Not far.
70 miles.
It's 90 miles. And there, let's see, do I have a map for it? No, I don't have one. But we're There it is, 90 miles. So most everything, if they were able to get out of anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico, if they were to take the Gulf Stream, whether going to Europe or the east coast of the United States, if you let that 90 miles blockaded off from Key West to Cuba, you can pretty much, I mean, and think about it, if the weather's good, if you have a ship about every 5 or 6 miles, you can blockade that whole part. So that's why it was so important. From the beginning of the war to the end of the war, where Fort Taylor was at Key West, it flew the American flag. Some of you know of Fort Jefferson. That is out in the Dry Tortugas, which is actually west of Key West. Matthew, you say them in the back? But that's where, from the very beginning of the war. Would the Keys be a very good place for plantations? Think there were very many slave-owning people down in the Keys. Guess where most of the people that lived in the Keys, which was actually, Key West was our largest city in Florida at that time also, but guess where most of them were from?
Cuba.
No.
Puerto Rico.
New England. Boston would be the place that most of them would call home. They were a bunch of Northerners that moved down to the Keys because Boston is the head of our shipping, so they moved to the Keys, and that's where they were at. Their relatives were New England, and this is why there were some people in the Keys that were wanting to be part of the South, but for the most part, it wasn't ever happening.
Did Florida have like one of the lowest populations?
Yeah, we were. All right, sorry for the pride of things. We were either of the 13 or the 11 states in the Confederacy. We were either the least important or the second least important. All right, we're battling Arkansas for that point.
Cool.
All right, and whenever you're saying you're battling Arkansas for something, okay, that's not a good thing. All right, but we were pretty much the least important. We had pretty much the smallest population. We had probably the least amount of money there. We didn't have a whole lot of good farmland or anything like that. So Virginia is by far the most important. Okay, we are on the bottom end, if not the very bottom.
Mr. Bass, yeah, it's salt.
Okay, well, that's what I'm going to get to here in a second for why we were sort of important too. All right, Fort Pickens. The second most important place would be Fort Pickens. Santa Rosa Island would be an island that comes out. Fort Pickens is on the edge of that island. Anything going in and out of Pensacola has to go by Fort Pickens. That was supposed to be the first shots of the Civil War. But General Beauregard was late in firing that, and that's where Fort Sumter ended up being the first place. And then from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, Fort Pickens was in Union control. So the two most important places in Florida, the Confederacy never controlled. Even though Pensacola was a Confederate town, nothing could get in and out to it. So the blockade basically made it a ghost town. The biggest battle that we would ever have in Florida was in Lusty, which, those of you that know where Lake City is, you go about an hour north of Gainesville, there is a Lusty. What happened there was there were some troops that landed in Jacksonville, and Jacksonville went back and forth between the Confederates and the Union Army. Basically, anytime the Union wanted to take over Jacksonville, they landed the soldiers in there, they took over it, they set it on fire 2 or 3 different times during the war. Then when they got done burning the town down, they would leave. They'd start to rebuild the town, and they would land again later on and burn it down again. But this is where, one time when they landed, they started coming inland to try to come after where food was coming to the Confederate Army and just try to stop it. Near Lake City, there was an army, and during one day, there was a battle that took place. Both armies were about 10,000 soldiers. The Confederates would win that battle at Lusty, so the biggest battle that takes place in Florida, the Confederates would win. And the whole scheme of the war, not very important. It's the most important place in Florida. The second biggest battle we would have in Florida would be at Natural Bridge, which is just south of Tallahassee. Actually a really neat place because the river actually goes underground for a little while. It goes through an underground cave. That's why it's called Natural Bridge. But what happened there was some troops, and actually they were a lot of black troops that landed. They were pretty much scavenging for supplies, and as they were going up towards Tallahassee, at the school, the seminary west of the Swanee school, there was some of the schoolboys there that then went with other people in Tallahassee to go defend it. Now, anyone know what the seminary west of the Swanee is known as today? Florida State University. Started by for you Gator people, and there where it originally was after University of Florida, but then they found records that it actually started before University of Florida. So in the 1851, there where what would be the Florida State. Now that's school, which was pretty much like a high school at that time, except for most high school age boys were off fighting. So realistically, most of the kids at that school were probably 13, 14, maybe 15 years old. So you had a bunch of lower teenagers, plus some older men, really old men from Tallahassee. They had two little, almost like toy cannons for that school that they took with them, and they defeated the really small army there. And that's the second biggest battle that took place in Florida. One of the claims of fame for Florida is that we are the only Confederate capital east of the Mississippi that was never taken over by the Union soldiers. Why is it that the great city of Tallahassee was never taken over by Union forces? Yeah, they didn't really want it. In the last year of the war, anytime they wanted to, Union cavalry rode in and out of Tallahassee. There just really wasn't anything worth taking in Tallahassee or any reason to set an army in Tallahassee and hold it. The only place in Florida really worthwhile was Key West at that time. There, so it is our claim to fame that yes, we weren't taken over, but the reason for it. So there is. What are we truly important for the Confederacy? Salt and cattle. All right, cows more than salt, but actually, if you salt the meat for the cows when you ship it, so it lasts longer. And to tell how loyal, and we didn't call them cowboys. They weren't called crackers yet. They were called cow hunters. To tell how loyal most of our cow hunters were, and there would be some in this area. Yeah, this area was not a place for growing plantations with tobacco or cotton. That was up in the Panhandle. Most of them here were basically small farmers, and you might have some of your cracker cattle there, which are smaller cows. They would have the horns that are the bigger on them. They have to be a little bit tougher type of cows because to survive our heat that we had. Not as high a quality of meat because again it's a little bit tougher that we have. But our cracker cows were something that the Confederate Army needed because they needed food. And what you would do is you would round up the herds, you would get them to where we would have a rail line that went from Cedar Key, and they would go and try to get to Atlanta, and from there get to other troops. But most of our cow hunters would be hiding their cows from the Confederate Army. Why would in this area of Florida would they be hiding their cattle from the Confederate Army? They love the Union Army?
The Confederate Army money is worthless.
They need food.
All right, what's that?
The Army's money is worthless.
Yeah, the Confederate money is worthless. So yeah, they would give you Confederate money. You went to the store, did you buy anything with it? No, so that's why basically they wanted to hide their cows because it wasn't that they didn't really care who won this war. Most of them are poor farmers. When the war ends, they're going to be poor farmers. Okay, I mean, they didn't really care either way. They didn't mind if they could sell their cows, but they want to sell their cows for gold or silver or something that is worthwhile, not sell it for pieces of paper that if the South lost was going to be totally useless, which that's what Confederate money was. All right, and that's here's where, and I have this with reflection questions, to make things kind of, for the AP side of things, except for Key West on here, here's what you kind of need to know from military places. What's important about Fort Sumter? Okay, the first shot. Who fired it? The Confederates, the South. That is important there, that the South fired the first shot. What's First Bull Run? First major battle. What's Antietam?
Single bloodiest thing.
Alright, but what's important about Antietam? What would come about after Lee's first loss?
The colony would be higher than Proclamation.
Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's where Antietam comes in for the Emancipation Proclamation. Vicksburg, what's important about Vicksburg? Yeah, the last place on the Mississippi River. So this is where step 2 of the Anaconda plan is completed. What is important about Gettysburg? It's not the last battle. The war would go on for 2 more years. Lee doesn't surrender, but Lee is defeated. It's his last invasion into the north. From that point on, Lee's having to fight constantly in Virginia. realistically, you can put the Vicksburg and Gettysburg together. I would say that those two together are the turning point of the war there, because they happen within a week of each other. What's important about Appomattox? Lee surrenders. And what's important about Key West? All right, blockade, most important place in Florida.
Did we ever finish the Anaconda thing, like capturing it?
Yeah, they did. That's where, and this is where, before Appomattox, actually, a few days before Richmond fell. All right, Lee had to abandon Richmond. All right, you can turn.